Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss the new team being assembled by Donald Trump. I'm joined by Sohrab Ahmari and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So since Trump won the election, a lot has been happening, lots of reports, some confirmed, some retracted, about who's being appointed to what positions in the new Trump administration. Geoff, what are we seeing so far in terms of foreign policy?
So it began with the announcement over the weekend that Nikki Haley and Mike Pompeo would not be included in the administration, which was taken by most observers to signal a kind of turn away from the more hawkish stances associated with both of those figures. Now, we have to be specific about hawkishness because it can mean different things depending on what region. So specifically, I'd say in terms of Ukraine and continued support for ongoing hostilities between Ukraine and Russia, and a sort of tendency to dismiss the need for negotiations or peace talks, would be certainly the position of a faction of the GOP that's aligned with much of the Democratic Party on a kind of maximalist posture towards Ukraine. And Pompeo and Haley would have both been aligned with that position. So the announcement that they would not be included was taken as a signal that the sort of, particularly I'd say the Ukraine hawks, but also perhaps the people who are more hawkish on Middle East policy, specifically towards Iran, were going to be marginalized. But then since then, and I think there are a lot of nuances here, which I imagine Sohrab will have things to say about. Since then, I think the conclusion has sort of been that was a bit of a feint, or it gave a false impression, because overall, the figures who have been brought into the administration do seem to be largely aligned, at least to some extent, although not to the same extent, on this, more maximalist and more hawkish foreign policy stance. So again, I think there's a bit of a variation, and I think Sohrab will have some interesting things to say about this. But it is worth noting that this has been met with disappointment by a lot of the more kind of populist and quote unquote America first type sort of commentators and fans, as well as people who, and I'd say specifically perhaps people who believed, along with evidently many Arab American voters in particularly Michigan, who ended up pulling the lever for Donald Trump, who believed that he might be a candidate who would, be willing and able to attempt to bring some kind of resolution to the conflict in the Middle East in a way that would benefit the Palestinians. And the people who seem most disappointed, and probably justifiably so, with the most recent picks, and I would highlight here Elise Stefanik, who really, is a congresswoman who is not necessarily particularly notable or experienced in foreign policy, and who really rose to prominence as part of this kind of inquisition of Ivy League presidents over their insufficient fealty to the sort of pro-Israel stance and willingness to allow pro-Palestinian protesters to operate and carry out protests on their campuses. And so Stefanik, that was clearly a pick that was designed to please, pro-Israel voices. And then another important figure who's been brought in here is Mike Huckabee as the ambassador to Israel, who is, as far as I can tell and understand, sort of, aligned with the territorial maximalist stance within Israel is seemingly in favor of annexation of the West Bank, and is thus kind of a clear choice that would make the sort of hardest right faction of the Netanyahu government quite happy. And so I think there's quite a bit of disappointment on that front. When it comes to Ukraine, which is a somewhat different, and you have sort of hawks who are more, hawkish when it comes to Iran, but less so when it comes to Ukraine, to Russia and Ukraine, and all sorts of variety there. But you have certainly you have figures who are now in this administration who have taken quite a hawkish line on Ukraine, including Mike Waltz, who's been nominated for national security advisor, and who seem to be arguing in recent years for a much more aggressive posture towards Russia, and kind of giving Ukraine missiles to be used to strike within Russia and things like that. So, you do have, again, figures who seem to embody stances that at least some members of the sort of Trump coalition, both voters and, pundits and commentators and policy experts, hoped would not have that kind of prominence and representation, both in terms of a sort of hardline stance towards Russia, and a hardline stance towards Iran and towards the Palestinians. And so, I think it's a little bit unclear. Obviously, Trump is the commander in chief, so he will presumably be asking these people to, carry out his will in terms of how he wants to address these conflicts. So, that doesn't change. That doesn't necessarily change. But, another figure who we can discuss is Marco Rubio being nominated for Secretary of State. And my understanding is Rubio is widely seen as a hawk, although, he has, as I understand it, sort of nuanced his position on Russia and Ukraine somewhat, at least. And then, the final point that I would make that, is perhaps less clear is, really ultimately the question of how the U.S. Is going to relate to and respond to the challenge of China. Now, this is an area where, as I understand it, although I don't know the details, Rubio has had, has devoted some serious attention, and I would point people to Compact contributor David Goldman's piece on this subject in the Asia Times. And the name that has not come up yet, although this and I think was widely expected and hoped for by many, is that of Elbridge Colby, who is a figure known for his overriding focus on the China threat, or the emerging and rising geopolitical rivalry with China, and for thus wanting to find some resolution to the other conflicts in which the U.S. is currently ensnared in both the Middle East and Russia, so as to better respond to the Pacific theater, and be able to respond effectively to that set of challenges. So the fact that Colby has not been chosen, I think says something about the direction. Although he's not been chosen for one of these top slots, he may still be selected for some role in the administration. And it was interesting to see in the Jewish Insider today a piece that seemed to suggest part of the reason he has not been chosen thus far is that he's not seen as reliably tough enough on Iran, as he's seen by some as being too conciliatory towards Iran. And so that suggests there are some factions of the Republican Party that don't see him as a reliable representative of the parts of the party that want to maintain a hard line and this maximum pressure approach, which is being advocated by some in the party. So I don't know. I will leave Sohrab to maybe fill in some more details. I do think it's an interesting moment because, again, you have these essentially three different contexts for thinking about the U.S. sort of geopolitical position, and depending on which one you focus on, you could see the same figures as relatively more hawkish or more dovish. But it does seem that there's kind of an emerging conflict probably within the administration between, again, this more kind of America first type position that that will attempt to resolve some of these conflicts and disentangle the U.S. versus a more kind of aggressive, outward-looking position, which would be more continuous, both with what the U.S. has done towards Russia in the past several years, and with earlier periods of our interventionist history in this century. So it does seem like we're entering a new foreign policy era, and I think exactly what shape it will take is still somewhat difficult to discern. So I'm curious what Sohrab would add to that.
Um, well, first of all, I'm surprised that Geoff didn't mention the interesting nomination of Fox News host, Fox and Friends host Pete
Yes,
Hegseth
right.
to be the Secretary of Defense. It is in some look it to a lot of people. It looks like a kind of a trollish or a kind of a prank nomination. If you do look at his background, like he served with distinction in the kind of global war on terror. He is a combat veteran of the global war on terror, of those operations. He has a degree from Princeton and a master's degree in public policy um, uh, from Harvard Kennedy School. So, like, the profile is not as crazy as it might as you first hear about it, and the fact that he's young, there's something to commend him for that. But he is also, like, insofar as he's made statements uh, about foreign policy, which is it's actually quite a record, right? He's, before he was a Fox News host, he ran a group for 7 years called Veterans for Freedom, which was basically an advocacy group for, quote unquote, staying the course in these kind of post 9/11 wars. Uh, you could call it neoconservative, hawkish, whatever. That's where he originated, and then, of course, as a Fox News host, has a long record of statements about why the U.S. should directly attack Iran, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just one more, I guess, piece of evidence for the broad reading of Geoff's, meaning that President Trump is staffing up with a lot of figures who, um, don't necessarily please the restraint community, and the kind of more hardline America first, and not to mention kind of progressive anti-war types, insofar as they still exist. However, it's worth thinking about, like, what Trump's foreign policy thinking is. And here I have to draw on my interview with JD Vance back in March or February for the New Statesman, in which he said that it's just, let me just read the actual quote, because I think it's just very illuminating. He said that Trump's approach to foreign policy, can't be described, quote, in any other way than Jacksonian, because I think it's a mixture of extreme skepticism towards intervention overseas, combined with an aggressive posture when you do intervene overseas. Don't punch often, but when you punch, punch really goddamn hard, end quote. That's how the now vice president elect described the overall picture. And I roughly think that that's correct. And so, as part of that, historically, at least going by his first term, what Trump has done is surround himself with figures you would think of as conventional hawks. And the way that people describe it is that he comes into the room, meeting with whoever, right? Especially kind of rival or adversary states. He had this sort of meeting with North Korea. And, back in the first term, in the back is seated this walrus mustached like figure of John Bolton, who's known to be a, freaking maniac. And it's part of his, like, making a deal approach, where it's like, oh man, I love Kim Jong Un. We're such good buddies. He does this, which, of course, the conventional mainstream media finds so abhorrent, that he does this, that he's clubby with dictators. but that around him are people who code differently to like Chinese officials, North Korean officials, Iranian officials. It's like, people who are known to have said, we should turn various parts of the world into parking lots exuberantly. So I think that's kind of the direction we're going again, where I really do believe, based on what I've read of his first term, that Trump is very much loath to get into new wars. That his approach is that he actually hates like large kinetic violence unless he absolutely has to or sees that he absolutely must. And but he needs like these hawkish figures to scare um, the other side into making deals. That's, I think, an interesting read. It's not totally accurate. I think there's also there's a lot of the people who backed him are conventional hawkish, like donors and stuff, and I'm no doubt that's rippling out in terms of the appointments that he makes. But the approach is not like a peacenik approach. It's not an anti-war approach. It's sort of like, I think emblematic was the killing of this Iranian general Qasem Soleimani. Why did that happen? It happened just before he was about to kind of bring about yet another wave of redeployment away from the Middle East. But on his way out, he kills Soleimani, which kind of sends a message like, we're on our way out, but don't you F with us, because this is what we can do. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's the pattern of the first term, and it's actually kind of interesting that he just immediately replicates it. By the way, the UN job, which is kind of a symbolic job, to be honest, especially where U.S. power is concerned, nothing that's really matters happens at the UN. He picks someone like Nikki Haley again, right? That pleases the pro-Israel community. She's going to be out there like denouncing various one-sided human rights resolutions where, like, when Syria denounces the human rights record of Israel, she'll be there like smacking them down, whatever. Everyone's happy, but that's not a policy role. Anyway, it's just a side note that he found kind of another Nikki Haley to put into that role, even though Nikki Haley herself is on the blacklist for jobs.
Yeah, I was curious what you thought of. I mean, so it sounds like what you're describing is it's sort of a variant of the madman theory. Is that right? Where if you have the John Bolton type kind of dead-eyed psychopath kind of hanging around, then people would be less likely. And again, I mean, there's some evidence that this was effective in certain arenas. So, I mean, is that roughly the idea, that it's a kind of madman theory type?
Yeah, that's what I would. That's what I'm getting at, kind of.
I'm curious just what you think about how this plays in the specific Israel-Palestine context, particularly if you have this combined with a sort of maximalist government in Israel, which is supported by Ambassador Huckabee and perhaps people in the administration, including the new Secretary of Defense, that you have the possibility of an actual annexation. This could, it seems to me, lead to a situation that would be, perhaps not resolvable through the I can see how that strategy has something to offer, particularly when it comes to dealing with regimes like North Korea and Iran, perhaps. But I'm curious how it plays when it comes to the much more thorny situation of the possibility of Israeli territorial expansion, actually being carried out. I'm just sort of a little, that seems like more of a question mark to me. So I don't know if either of you have thoughts.
I can't speak to that, but I think it's clear that Trump's promise to the American people was that if you vote for him for president, we're going to not have any pointless, endless wars. And so he also spoke about the Israel-Palestine conflict in terms suggesting that he wanted to see it wrapped up quickly. So I expect that uh, under him, Israel may enjoy a freer hand in some ways, but will also have certain kind of pressures in terms of a timetable placed on it. That's really just, I guess, but that's what I take from his rhetoric. And I do think that a long, drawn out, managed conflict would represent a failure on the part of the Trump administration, simply in terms of what it has promised. One thing I want to bring up as we record, I see that Tulsi Gabbard has been appointed Director of National Intelligence, the position overseeing various U.S. intelligence agencies. That seems like a very distinctively Donald Trump pick. It's impossible to imagine any other Republican president making this move, given Gabbard's long record of criticizing the conduct of surveillance and other intelligence measures uh, under the war on terror. This was a big theme for her when she was a Democratic congresswoman in more left wing terms, and then more recently, as she's made a turn toward the right, she's spoken quite critically of various instances in which the U.S. security state has targeted people for their perceived dangerous right wing extremism, whether they're Latin mass traditionalists or pro lifers who are violating clinic protection laws. So it's a quite interesting move from Trump, and I think just something to throw in the mix here.
And also Matt Gaetz for Attorney General. So these are nominations that are clearly aimed at disciplining the agencies to which they are going to, right? Like Gaetz has been an opponent of, rightly so, I think, of democratic lawfare, the use of law enforcement to undo the outcome of the 2016 election. Of course, as you said, Matthew, Gabbard has a long history as a critic of the intelligence community. I like these. These are nice. Just for the sheer sake of mixing it up, so to speak, right? That's kind of refreshing in a way, actually. That's my gut response because I'm just reacting to this news as it's come in. As Matthew said, it's just breaking.
Maybe most important of all, it's been announced that 2 men have been selected to head the new Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE. Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. That's twice the efficiency, right? That's pretty good.
Yeah. So, okay, I was listening to an interview. Sorry, I'll just be quick on this, but it was listening to an interview with Vanis Varoufakis, the former leftist finance minister of Greece, and he was
former finance minister, continuing leftist, right?
Yes. good catch. And he was very dismissive of the Elon thing in terms of, he was like, what's worse is when you have Goldman Sachs types running the U.S. Treasury. This thing, lots of other people have said it as well. He just characterizes like, anytime in government you give someone a kind of blue ribbon commission, like go and study it for us and make recommendations. It's usually symbolic. It usually comes to naught. Certainly my favorite of this, of course, is in the most important government of all, in a sense, in terms of in an eternal sense, namely the Holy See. When Pope Francis says, yes, the issue of female deaconesses, here's a 10-year commission to study that issue. That's basically a way of killing that. Now I'm not saying that's what's going to happen here. I think they're going to make some recommendations, and Trump, of course, Trump owes something, especially to Musk, having had his campaign bankrolled by it. Maybe some of the elements, some of the most obvious sort of ridiculous fat cutting. It's just, of course, if you go down line by budget, you find ridiculous things in the federal budget, like whatever, like crayons for lab monkeys so they can let out their stress, stuff like that. $250,000. Okay, easy to eliminate. So that's my gut feeling about that. However, Yeah, I will make a pitch for what I think is the emerging Trumpian political economy, of which kind of Musk's worldview is part of it, which is I've decided it's actually a return to the Gilded Age GOP, which, all those presidents of the late 19th century whose names you struggled to memorize when you were in high school or middle school. That era was characterized by protectionism externally. Workers are protected from uh, uh, encroachments on their jobs by other kind of commercial powers. So that was the age of the tariff. I mean, the age of the tariff was most of U.S. history, but that in that time certainly was true. But internally, it was much more laissez-faire and libertarian. And I think that's kind of what we're getting out of the Trump administration: is external protectionism, internal libertarianism. It's fraught with dangers. It's also an opportunity for dynamism. It's going to be interesting, but thinking sort of dialectically, I think, you'd think, and I want to put this out there because it's like kind of a compacty theory, is like the New Deal style management of class conflict, which I celebrate and I think is a good thing, 50, 60, 70, 80 years later had become moribund. And, in a way, the administrative class mediates between, the two principal classes that drive social change and social progress, namely the capitalists and the working class. And so in a way, it blunts the kinetic aspects of class conflict. So what we're going to get is getting rid of that in a way, or downsizing it. You're going to have a lot of pain for working people, for sure, but you also might get a reactivation of class consciousness and militancy on a scale that we haven't seen since the late 19th century and the decades before the New Deal. So I think, I don't know, that's very speculative, and I'm thinking, and I will of course be accused of deploying Marxist categories by some of our listeners, but I just think there's something to that like the mediation of the administrative state maybe is weakened, and therefore you activate the bourgeoisie as a class, and therefore dialectically you also activate in reaction, in a boomerang effect, you activate the working class.
Yeah, I mean, notably here, Musk is also party to a lawsuit that is attempting to declare the National Labor Relations Board unconstitutional. So it's an interesting fact that he, is essentially, and along with Jeff Bezos and other figures who might not be understood to share his politics in a sort of partisan sense. Nonetheless, there is an attempt on the part of some of these oligarchs to essentially kind of do an end run around what remains of that kind of mediating New Deal order that was provided a means of resolving class conflict. And so the results of that is that you could end up with a far more sort of naked exercise of oligarchical power, of which what Musk is currently doing would just be a kind of dress rehearsal, but in turn would potentially lead to a much more open conflict than you see today. So yeah, I think this whole Department of Government Efficiency it's so bizarre, and like there's something just deeply kind of postmodern, sort of Baudrillardian about it. It's almost this kind of parody of itself, as you said. It's literally it on one hand looks like one of these kind of make work type kind of phony commissions that if anybody has been in, I mean, academia would be another example of where, like, if you want to just kind of like keep some people busy, you create a commission and give them 5 years to study some problem, and then by the time they come up with their report, everybody's kind of forgotten about it. So it's like it's a classically inefficient way that sort of bureaucratic structures operate. So it's almost like a parody of itself, and of course the tweets about it have reinforced this point endlessly. As one of you joked previously, it's even the absurdity of having a committee, a Department of Government Efficiency, which has two heads, not just one. So it's like redundancy compounded with redundancy, radical inefficiency in the name of efficiency. And then at the same time, it's also bizarre that it's being called a department, whereas it clearly is not that. What exactly its status is completely unclear. But nonetheless, people are referring to it as a department. If you look at the New York Times listing of cabinet appointments, it even refers to these as cabinet appointments. But these are not cabinet positions. They don't exist. They've never been created. There is no Department of Government Efficiency. It's just a thing that was made up. So it's essentially kind of government through meme. And it's of course connected to the Doge meme, and it's seemingly called this in reference to the Doge meme and the Doge coin. So it's this kind of bizarre sort of performative governance through kind of pure meme warfare, and it's very unclear exactly what is going on with it, but it does seem to be it does signal something about, I suppose, the kind of para-governmental or quasi-governmental entities, um, that in any instance are going to, that there are sort of shadow government type entities that are going to kind of be attached to any administration, and you're going to have people who don't have any official status who are actually going to have a great deal of access to the president, to the White House. And so this isn't an unfamiliar phenomenon. What's weird about it is that it's being kind of officially established, except that it's not really official. It's kind of the simulacrum of an official department and set of cabinet appointments, when in fact, whether it will amount to anything other than just, Elon and Vivek Ramaswamy, like, having meetings with Trump once in a while, or even that is completely unclear. So it's a very bizarre but kind of indicative spectacle, as far as, on one hand, these things that are already kind of an unofficial part of how government works, i.e., like oligarchs have access to leaders, and then that it's sort of being memetically officialized while not actually being officialized is just all very strange. So yeah, I think it's quite a fascinating development, and that this announcement was made before numerous sort of actual very central cabinet positions is also a kind of revealing fact. So yeah, it's definitely a strange and somewhat ambiguous aspect of this administration, and it's in its second incarnation.
I do want to take a moment to talk about Trump's appointments in terms of border security. The most high profile being Kristi Noem, the South Dakota governor, who had a kind of brief moment in the sun as a potential presidential contender. Her candidacy was sunk by a kind of corn pone story about taking Old Yeller out back and shooting him because he had gone rabid or something like that. Now she'll be working as head of the Department of Homeland Security, along with Tom Homan, Trump's main border czar. Looks like a group of people who's very committed to implementing Trump's agenda. How effective they'll be, I don't know. Any thoughts from you guys?
Just very quickly to add that Stephen Miller is deputy chief of staff, just below Susie Wiles, who's his chief of staff, and of course, like he's being given what is reportedly a vast policy portfolio, and the most important element of which is, of course, what is near and dear to Stephen Miller's heart, which is immigration. So, yeah, I think this is one where I thought this is small d democracy at work. Like, Trump Vance ran on the border very strongly, and when they got elected and as soon as the election outcome was clear, you get a couple of border-oriented appointments. It's like that's what the people voted for. So it'll. I think like the questions remains of what the largest deportation operation in the country will mean. Vance suggested it will start with aliens with criminal backgrounds. Fair enough, okay, but that's not going to get at the full scope of the presence of undocumented migrants in the United States. But that's an open question of how like they will actually implement that. If they like just restore remain in Mexico, it'll reduce the border surge. It's just very, very Trump. It's just like you get what you voted for. He promised he would deal with this, and he's appointing some seriously tough people to do it.
Yeah, and just to add to that, it's an interesting moment at the border because the Biden administration seems to have made a deal with the Mexican government to bus migrants away from the U.S. border to the south of Mexico. They've been doing that for quite a few months. It's really helped lead to a decline in the number of border crossings, but it's not sustainable indefinitely. It's creating problems in Mexico with these towns in the south just being flooded with migrants and local political backlash there. So uh, that kind of informal arrangements that Biden was able to create, his own kind of ad hoc version of Remain in Mexico, is probably going to fall apart very soon if it isn't falling apart at this very moment. And yeah, Trump will have to have something else to stem the tide.
So, just two thoughts on this. One, I would point people back to Juan Rojas's coverage of the relationship that was established between Trump and AMLO when both of them were in office. And I think a big question is going to be how Trump relates to AMLO's successor, Claudia Sheinbaum, who was recently inaugurated. And what Juan points out is that I think part of why that relationship worked is that they both can work quite well as transactional politicians, and that in a sense this issue has to be addressed in at least a partly transactional way, which is that the incentives for Mexico are to uh, allow people to come through Mexico and also to leave as quickly as possible, right? Because obviously that just as they strain our services in the United States, they also strain services in Mexico. And so basically, the incentive for Mexico is to help shuttle people through, unofficially as quickly as possible, so that they cause as few problems as possible. And so, in order to alter those incentives, there just has to be a transactional approach, which is to, essentially give them something, give Mexico something in return for being willing to help address this border influx on the U.S. side, because otherwise it just doesn't really have any incentive to do so. So anyway, I'd point people back to Juan's piece, Lessons of the AMLO-Trump Bromance, which was published in March of this year. And it just, I think, has some interesting pointers for how this relationship could be productive in the way that it was, and when Trump and AMLO found a sort of modus operandi for working together on this issue, not just through Remain in Mexico, but other kind of shared initiatives. And again, that kind of transactional approach that Trump has as a politician can kind of bear dividends here. Juan argues in any case. So I would recommend people check that out because I think it has some relevance to what we will see coming up. I think the other thing that seems important here in terms of Miller and these sort of hardline appointments is that there is a kind of issue of what you're signaling to potential migrants elsewhere in the world. And so, a simple way of thinking about these appointments is not just, we don't know exactly what they're going to do. I think one of the, one of the big questions, which, was not resolved or was ultimately just not done, in the first Trump administration was the use of E-Verify, which we've published on previously. And that basically, this is something that employers are going to lobby against. They don't like to have to use E-Verify. So it's always going to be a difficult thing to implement, to pass. But at the same time, you're not going to have you're not going to have a kind of comprehensive and sort of systemic approach to this issue without dealing with it on the employer side. So I think that's kind of one thing to look out for in terms of what's actually going to be done. But then, the other point is, basically part of why the migrant influx happened is that you had a Biden administration that was coming in and essentially signaling to the world that it would be receptive, welcoming, and make things relatively easy and comfortable for people who wanted to come here. And so I think part of what the new administration is trying to signal is the opposite, right? That they're going to make it difficult, they're going to try to keep you out, and they're going to try to deport you if you do get in. And so that on the level of kind of advertising, it sends a message to the world that, you have to invest a lot of money and take huge risks in order to make this journey. And so if you rate your chances of succeeding quite low, then that's going to be something you factor into whether to take that risk and invest tens of thousands of dollars in these kind of odysseys that the migrants undertake to get here, because of course most of them are not coming from Mexico anymore, right? In fact, most of them are coming from much farther afield. So I think that's another thing that's going on here. It's like the reduction is not just through sheer enforcement, but it's through sending a message to the world that these laws will be enforced. People will be stopped, intercepted, and deported. And then, if you're considering doing this, the word is going to get out, including through these kind of networks that, essentially market sort of human trafficking throughout the world to bring people here. That's not going to be that's not going to be as sure of a thing as it might have seemed under the Biden administration. So it seems clear to me that that's part of the strategy beyond any, what specific policy measures they end up taking, is just to kind of broadcast this message out to the world and thus reduce the or kind of alter the incentives in terms of what people are thinking about who might consider trying to make this journey.
With that, thanks, Geoff. Thank you, Sohrab, and thanks to all our listeners. Until next time.